In today's video, we're going to cover the most difficult part of risk assessment, which is, yes, walkthroughs. So this might be the most painful and difficult part of doing risk assessment, and I've heard many auditors through the years yell and complain about having to do this part of the audit. But maybe I'm strange, but I enjoy doing walkthroughs. So hopefully it will be contagious and you'll get some of this and feel more confidence as you do the walkthroughs in the days ahead. So I'm going to give you some tips in doing walkthroughs. I'm going to explain what a walkthrough is. I'm going to show you how to do this. And the end result will be you'll have the internal control information that will enable you to plan your audit procedures. The whole idea here in looking at walkthroughs is to see if there's any internal control weaknesses. If there are, that might impact the planned audit procedures, and it usually does. If the controls are strong, then you might be able to do less work as you do your substantive procedures in, say, receivables and payables and cash and inventory, those areas that you audit later on after you plan the engagement. So let's take a look at Chapter 7, Walkthroughs. We're in Chapter 7 of my book, Audit Risk Assessment Made Easy, so I hope you've got your copy handy as we continue to go through the videos. Each of these videos aligns with the chapters in this book. Chapter 7, Walkthroughs. Let's begin by asking the question, what is a walkthrough? You know, if you've been around a while and you've done audits for years, then you know what this is. If you're new, you might not know what a walkthrough is. So let me explain for the uninitiated. Even for those of you that have been around a long time like me, I think you'll learn some things here. So a walkthrough is a cradle-to-grave review of a transaction cycle. We're starting at the very beginning of a cycle, and let's pick accounts payable as an example. And we're going to look at the purchase order. We're going to look at the receiving documents. We're going to look at the invoices that are keyed into the accounts payable system. We're going to look at who authorizes the payment of those invoices. We're going to see who's reviewing the budget to actual for expenses compared to budget. Now, the whole reason we're doing the walkthrough is to see if there are any internal control weaknesses. So doing the walkthrough is not just looking at what gets posted in the general ledger and when. It's also, or it's mainly about looking at the internal controls that surround that transaction area. So sometimes I see auditors, they'll document, say, the check number or other various and sundry information, but they're not really defining what the internal controls are. If you don't document what the internal controls are, then you really haven't done very much. Remember, we're trying to see whether or not there's internal control weaknesses, and if there are, that's going to impact the audit plan. But even if the controls are great, which I hope they are, it's going to impact my audit plan because I might do less work because there's a strong system. So you're gaining an understanding. Look at the bottom of this slide. You're gaining an understanding of the internal controls so that you can plan your engagement. Let's also look at what a walkthrough is not. Now, sometimes I'll look in an audit file and somebody's taken an accounting manual, say a PDF of the accounting manual, and they placed it in the electronic audit file and they say, walkthrough done. That doesn't work. So, just having a manual that says hit F8 to process the checks, that's not a walkthrough of controls. So, dot number one, following a transaction through the system without reviewing controls, that's not a walkthrough. Placing the accounting manual, as we just said, in the file, that's not a walkthrough. Asking, this is my favorite one that's not a walkthrough, is everything the same as last year? So sometimes we ask this question, and if the client says, yes, everything's the same, we think we're done. We're not done. You'll recall in Chapter 6, Activity Level Controls, we said we needed to be aware of the design and the implementation of controls. Well, if those controls have changed during the year, say the design of the control has changed, or maybe the control was not performed throughout the year. So if your accounts payable supervisor was out for 6 weeks because he was sick, then maybe some of the controls were not functioning for the whole year. If that's true, we need to be aware of it. But if we just ask, is everything the same as last year? And they say, yeah, everything's about the same. That's not really a walkthrough. We need to walk the transaction through the cycle, and we need to be making observations and inspections. So as we do a walkthrough, we're doing 3 things. We inquire, we inspect, and we observe. We inquire, we inspect, and we observe. Inquiry alone, as we saw in the last video, is not sufficient. So you want to ask questions about the internal controls and about the process that occurs in the transaction cycle, but you also need to make observations. So if I'm walking an accounts payable transaction through the system and I see that Susie, she signs off on the purchase order authorizing the transaction. I see that Johnny receives the ordered goods on the receiving dock, and he counts how many there are that's been received and keys that into the system. And if Joan receives the invoice and she keys that into the accounts payable module, and let's say Mrs. Johnson, the supervisor, she's reconciling all of this information. So I make the observation, hey, there's 4 different people involved in this process. We call that segregation of duties. That's a good thing. When I observe, I see that there's multiple people involved in the process. That is in addition to the inquiries that I'm making. So I'm asking questions, but I'm also observing how many people are involved in the process and who is doing what. Now, we said there was a third element, and that's inspection. And going back to my accounts payable example, I might look at the purchase order. I might look at the invoice. I might look at the signed check that cleared the bank statement. I might look at the bank reconciliation for that particular bank account that the check was processed in for that month. I inquire, I observe, I inspect. Now, as I do so, I'm noting things such as appropriate segregation of duties. I'm seeing whether or not the right people authorize the payment. So, if there's only one person involved in this process, then there's no segregation of duties, and we've really got a problem. Now, if that was the case, I'm going to do a lot more work in the accounts payable area because the internal controls are not designed appropriately. So again, we do the walkthrough to see, if there's any internal control weaknesses. If there are, I'm going to bring those internal control weaknesses into my risk assessment summary form. One question I get from time to time is, can you use the prior year walkthroughs? And the answer is yes, you can. Now, as we were just saying, you still have to do the walkthrough in the current year, but you can leverage that work from the prior year. So you don't want to do a walkthrough from scratch each year. You do it in the first year, and then you continue to roll that document forward. You make those observations, you inspect those documents, you inquire, you ask questions, and you update the prior year walkthrough with the current year information. But you can most certainly use the prior year walkthroughs. So I say here, yeah, it's fine to roll forward your previous year's walkthrough. Just perform and update. And if you do, you're fine. Now, if you just roll that prior year walkthrough forward and you don't do any current year reviews of what's going on, then that could be trouble, because if the controls change and you don't do the walkthrough and you're not aware that the controls changed, then you could have material misstatements and not be aware of it. Another question, can you lower control risk based on your walkthrough? Normally the answer here is no. I won't say that's always true, but most of the time it's true. So we're doing that walkthrough of one transaction normally, and that's not a test of controls for effectiveness. And you have to do a test of controls for effectiveness in order to bring your control risk below high or below maximum. You normally can't use a walkthrough as a basis to bring your control risk lower. And you see that here on the slide. Normally, your audit walkthroughs are not sufficient to bring your control risk below high. You're going to need to do a test for effectiveness, and many times that might be a situation where you're looking at 40, 50, 60 transactions to test the effectiveness of the control. Looking at one transaction usually doesn't get you there. Now let's talk about documenting walkthroughs. Even if you do a great walkthrough and you don't document that appropriately in the work papers, then you're going to have problems in peer review. So we want to make sure we do the walkthrough, but we also want to make sure we document the walkthrough so the peer reviewer or your partner or reviewer can see that you've done the right things. You can document a walkthrough with a narrative summary, or you can do so in a flowchart or with a checklist. The audit standards don't say which of these you should use. It just says you need to gain an understanding of the internal controls. So whichever of these works best for you, then that's what I would do. Now, I'll tell you, my preference is to use the narrative option here. When I do the inquiries and inspections and observations, I'm taking notes, and I'm usually doing this with an electronic device, so I'm recording the audio and the notes, and they sync up together. I use an app called Notability on my iPad, so I'm recording what's being said, but I'm also writing notes, and the audio syncs up with the notes, so later on I can go back and tap on a word that I've written, and it'll bring me to that part of the conversation that was going on when I wrote that word. Now, this is quite handy. If you're like me, I can't remember everything somebody's saying to me, so I'm recording the audio and the notes, and then I can go back and use Notability. And you can choose other software products, but I'm using Notability on my iPad. Another thing that I'm doing is I'm taking pictures with my iPhone. So I'm taking pictures and I'm recording the audio as I do the walkthroughs. That way I can go back and look and review what I saw from my iPhone and also what I heard from my iPad. Now if you do a narrative walkthrough like I do, when I get done, I go into a Word document, nothing fancy here, and I just start typing what it is I saw in terms of the transaction flow. But again, the important thing is the internal controls. Sometimes I will embed the pictures from my iPhone in that Word document so you can actually see what I saw. And then I'm identifying the key controls in that transaction area and any control weaknesses if we have any. So here's an example of a key control, and you can see I've just said additions of new vendors is limited to 2 persons in the accounts payable department. Limiting the number of people that can add new vendors reduces my risk. If everybody could add new vendors, then my risk goes up because anybody could add a vendor. Maybe if I was in accounts payable, I'd add a vendor called Charles Hall and write a check to myself. But limiting the number of people that can add new vendors reduces my risk. And so I'm describing that key control, and I go on to say that the accounts payable software provides the CFO with a new vendor list. So anytime new vendors are added, there's another person outside of accounts payable that sees the new vendors. Another part of this is we see persons adding new vendors can't sign checks, so that's a positive too. So we've got some controls there that bring down the risk in the accounts payable area. Sometimes I'm asked, what is a key control? And a key control simply is one that prevents material misstatements. As you do these walkthroughs, you're going to see a myriad of internal controls, and some of those are not really important. The important ones are those that prevent a material misstatement. So as you look at an internal control, ask yourself, does this control prevent a material misstatement? If it does, then I would say it's a key control. Now, in your walkthrough documentation, you want to highlight your key controls. I often do this by typing the words in bold, key control, or I might even change that font to red so it stands out. But I want to be able to look at that walkthrough documentation and see what my key controls are. What I'll do is I'll get a prior year financial statement, and I'll usually look at the balance sheet and the income statement. I'm looking at the areas that are material, and then I'm asking myself, what are the relevant assertions for those areas? And then I ask myself, what controls would ensure that those assertions have been appeased, that they're okay, that the controls are working appropriately in relation to those assertions. I've looked at some walkthroughs and there's unnecessary clutter. There's language there, there's sentences there, sometimes whole paragraphs there that are not needed. So we want to keep it concise enough that it communicates clearly, but it also addresses the key controls. Another thing to think about as you do your walkthroughs is what are these significant transaction cycles? So we're doing this walkthrough in relation to significant classes of transactions, significant account balances, and significant disclosures. You don't need to do a walkthrough, say, for prepaid assets if it's not material and it's not significant. We do the walkthroughs only in relation to those transaction cycles and account balances and disclosures that are significant. So you need to make that determination before you start doing walkthroughs. So I do the walkthrough and then I'm highlighting the control weaknesses, and I do so just like you see on the screen here. I've got control weakness in red, and then I say what the control weakness is. Now, I do this to make it stand out because later on I need to communicate the internal control weaknesses where there's a significant deficiency or material weakness. I have to communicate those in writing. I can go back to my walkthroughs and I can see control weakness, and then I know I need to consider whether or not that is reportable in writing. So you see the example here, only one signature is required for check disbursements. Johnny Mann signs checks, has possession of the check stock, keys the invoices in the accounts payable system, and reconciles the related bank account. Not a good situation. Probably a material weakness. So I know I've got to report the weakness, but to the point of this video, we're talking about how does it impact the audit. It's going to impact how I plan the audit procedures in the accounts payable area. If this is true, I'm going to do more work because there's a lack of segregation of duties. If there are significant internal control weaknesses, then I'm going to place those on my risk assessment summary form, and that'll be part of my basis for the responses that I'll plan to perform in my audit program. So that's my summary of walkthroughs, and I hope you find it helpful. Just remember what you're trying to do here. We're trying to look at the internal controls so we can see if they're strong and I can decrease the amount of audit work I'm doing, or they're weak and I need to increase the amount of work I'm doing. I'm going to start with the birth of a transaction, take it all the way through the system. I'm looking at the controls. I'm inquiring, I'm observing, I'm inspecting. In the next video, we're going to take a look at overriding controls. So sometimes management they'll have good controls. They just decide they want to do something they shouldn't do, so they override controls. So you'll want to stay with us, and next week we'll take a look at Chapter 8, the override of controls. I hope you found this video helpful, and until I see you next week, God bless and take care. Bye now.